so part of, I think a lot of times we think about schools as sites where certain social forces shape what's going on, that schools are sort of these downstream. If you think about gentrification, like they're these downstream sites that are affected by broader social processes. And the Homeland Security School really forces us to say, sure, geopolitics, geopolitical struggles shape what goes on in schools, but schools actually participate in the making of geopolitics, that the state often mobilizes the school to contribute to its geopolitical agenda. And that could be the global war on terror. It could be, nationalism within the United States, but that schools actually are affected by and affect these broader geopolitical agendas.
So we want to transition into how this work then informs and has shaped your current book project, your new book, Suspect Communities. So this is the first major qualitative study of countering violent extremism, or the U.S. government's Countering Violent Extremism Program, CVE. It's arisen in major cities in the United States since 2011. Could you talk a bit about what drew you to this project? Give us some background on the CVE program itself and how you approached your study of it.
Sure. So as I was finishing up a curriculum of fear, the FBI released a online portal, this online module for high school kids. It wanted to mandate that all high school kids had to participate in this module, and it was called Don't Be a Puppet. And Don't Be a Puppet essentially is trying to teach kids not to become terrorists. And it got a lot of pushback from the American Federation of Teachers, of Muslim advocacy groups for, chilling political dissent, political discussion in class, sort of the free exchange of ideas. The idea was that this focus on terrorism would criminalize kids for, internet searches, for trying to do research on specific topics. And so I really wanted to know more about why the FBI was trying to insert itself into, some kind of national curriculum agenda, and what it was trying to achieve by mobilizing schools to participate to get all kids basically to have to take this module to graduate from high school. And so Don't Be a Puppet, that online module, is actually a part of the broader Obama administration's countering violent extremism framework. And so countering violent extremism, or CVE, is framed as this progressive alternative to the domestic war on terror. So instead of doing sting operations, instead of infiltrating mosques, the idea is that we can mobilize community members, we can mobilize teachers and guidance counselors and mental health professionals to, through the course of their daily work, identify people who they think are future terrorists. So the idea is that teachers would both use their classroom to identify young people who might be vulnerable to becoming terrorists, and also use their classroom to teach kids not to become terrorists. And so that was really the connecting piece between the first project and the second project. Was, again, schools are being tasked with this geopolitical national security agenda, and many schools are taking up this mantle as being good citizens, that this is what good schools do, is they participate in these projects. So the book was really exploring not just schools, but all the different ways countering violent extremism shows up in the United States, actually from the perspectives of national security practitioners themselves. So to understand what kinds of narratives and discourses do they engage, so they themselves buy into it, but also so they can convince communities to police and survey themselves in the name of national security.
Yeah, and I think you, again, talking about like how the construction of a good citizen, right? That identity and how that becomes created through schools. Could you also then discuss the contemporary roots of Islamophobia and the anti-Muslim sentiment in the US, and how it became articulated and reinforced through that CVE program?
Yeah, so one of the things I try to do in the book project is to do this reframing of Islamophobia as anti-Muslim racism, to get away from the idea that Islamophobia is some kind of individualized fear, to think through how anti-Muslim racism is actually baked into institutions and policies in ways that harm and criminalize and dispossess Muslim communities in the United States since, the arrival of African Muslims in the United States during slavery. So part of this book is trying to think through how is anti-Muslim racism institutionalized through national security policies, and who's called on to do the daily work of anti-Muslim policing, anti-Muslim surveillance, and essentially anti-Muslim racism. And so we see how that's actualized through these policies that are calling on teachers to identify people who they think are terrorists, because it's invariably Muslim or people who they think are Muslim who are targeted as potential terrorists. You're not seeing white Christian kids who are, threatening to shoot up a school. They're not thought of as terrorists. They're not preemptively criminalized as future terrorists. But that one way anti-Muslim racism gets institutionalized is through national security policy.
And you spend some time talking about the gender dynamics of anti-Muslim racism, and I found that quite interesting and important. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think there's the overrepresentation of the idea of the sort of brown male menace, right? The terrorist who is both Muslim and male, and so Muslim men and boys are more likely to be identified and targeted as future terrorists. Although women who cover are also seen as the most extreme forms of Islam, even though that's not true, and how the hijab becomes a political marker, right? Not just a religious marker, but it somehow signifies conservatism, barbarism, like all these racialized narratives that get mapped onto them. But most often Muslim women and girls are positioned as supporters of terrorists. We can think about Omar Mateen's wife being prosecuted for her alleged support of her husband's actions. And so, yeah, women are often seen as supporters, and because they're seen as supporters, Muslim women are then called on to be the ones who prevent future terrorist attacks. So they're the ones who should teach their children not to become terrorists. They're the ones who should monitor their homes and their mosques and their community centers for potential terrorists. So there's a responsibilization that happens within Muslim communities that unevenly falls on Muslim women in a way that it doesn't fall on Muslim men, because Muslim men are preconceived as the terrorist threat, as where the terrorist threat comes from.
Mm-hmm. And how do those dynamics then map onto the sort of broader racial economy of US society in relation to who gets defined as a terrorist and who doesn't?
Yeah, so I think what we see is this growing concern around terrorism gets further weaponized against communities of color. So we can think about the water protectors at Standing Rock. They were not only portrayed as terrorists, they were portrayed as jihadists, specifically like Shia female fighters. That's how they were termed, right? So they're indigenous water protectors who are now being framed as Islamic extremists. And through that marker, the federal government said we're now justified to implement these war tools to disrupt and discredit the water protectors. And there is also this language that there's this jihadist bleed out model that was applied to the water protectors. So the idea was the water protectors are here and they're just going to go somewhere else, just like people in Bosnia went somewhere else to go fight. And so we need to lock people up. We need to criminalize people so they don't start a riot and a protest and an uprising somewhere else. So you can see how the logics, like global war on terror logics, then seep into and articulate with domestic policing policies. You can think about this about the category of Black identity extremists. that is another terror category that was used to justify, I think it was called Operation Iron Fist, to disrupt Black political organizers. So we see how the widening of the domestic war on terror is not just about criminalizing and brutalizing Muslim communities, but it then is used to reinforce other kinds of racial hierarchies and other brutal practices. So we already know that the police are killing Black people in the streets, and this becomes yet another wedge to justify that brutality.